My controlling husband isolated me for 20 years. My daughter just showed me the truth. For 20 years, I thought my husband loved me. He just showed it differently. Not letting me attend my best friend's wedding because married women don't need friends meant he wanted me all to himself. Making me quit my accounting job 3 days after our wedding meant he wanted to provide. Forbidding me from talking to any man, including my own brother, meant he was protective. When he poured boiling water on my arms for undersalting his food, I told myself he was stressed from work. When he called me a whore for accepting mail from our 70-year-old postman, I thought maybe my smile was too friendly. When he refused to let me learn to drive because only sluts need that kind of freedom, I believed him. When he installed cameras in every room to keep me safe, I was grateful for his concern. My daughter changed everything. She graduated college last month, got her own apartment downtown with money she'd secretly saved since she was 16. When I called to congratulate her on her independence, her voice was strange, hollow. "Mom, we need to talk. Come to my place. Alone. Don't tell Dad." "Honey, I can't drive, you know that. And your father has to approve any. I'm picking you up in 20 minutes. Pack a bag. Be ready." She'd never defied the rules before. My hands shook as I threw clothes into a grocery bag, hiding it behind the washing machine. When her car pulled up, I ran out like a teenager sneaking away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The second we entered her apartment, she broke down sobbing. "Mom, I can finally save you from him." "Save me from what?" "From Dad. From that prison." She pulled out her laptop, hands trembling. "Mom, do you realize you haven't seen your friends in 15 years? That you're not allowed to have a phone with internet? That you can't even buy groceries without his written permission? That he reads every text you send me through the monitoring app?" She turned the screen toward me. "I've been documenting everything since I was 14. Every incident, every rule, every time he hurt you. Videos, dozens of them. Him screaming at me for wearing tinted chapstick, calling me a prostitute, throwing plates because dinner was 5 minutes late, pushing me down the stairs because I answered the door for a female delivery driver without asking permission first. The time he locked me in the bedroom for 3 days because I smiled at his brother during Thanksgiving. Mom, remember when he made you call your sister and tell her you never wanted to speak to her again? I recorded it. You were crying so hard you could barely speak and he was standing behind you directing every word. The video played. I watched myself, thin and shaking, reading from his script while he gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave bruises. This isn't love, Mom. It's abuse. You have a master's degree from Princeton. You were brilliant, had job offers from Fortune 500 companies. He systematically destroyed you. 20 years of suppressed memories flooded back like a tsunami. My friend staging an intervention before he isolated me completely. My sister sobbing at my wedding, begging me not to go through with it. My mother's last words before cancer took her. I failed you by letting you marry that monster. The birthday cards that never came because he told everyone I was dead. The job interviews I had to cancel because he'd hidden my clothes. The bruises I covered with makeup that he said I deserved. I collapsed, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. My daughter held me, this brave girl who'd waited years until she could offer me shelter before showing me the truth. "I'm divorcing him," I said, the words feeling like breaking through water after drowning. I called him with shaking hands. For the first time in 20 years, when he started yelling, I yelled back, told him I wanted a divorce. He went silent, then in the calmest voice I'd ever heard said, "Someone's poisoning you against me. I'll fix that. I always fix things." The line went dead. My daughter started pulling out documents she'd prepared. Lawyers' numbers, shelter information, safety plans. "Mom, I've been planning this for 3 years. We're going to be..." Footsteps on her fire escape. Her apartment was on the 7th floor. "Mom," she whispered, face draining of color. I didn't tell him my address. I've been so careful. The footsteps stopped right outside her living room window. A shadow fell across the curtains. Then we heard it. Him humming, "You Are My Sunshine," the same song he hummed every night before he hurt me. "He found me," my daughter breathed. "But Mom, I never told anyone where I lived. How did he..." That's when we saw it. The second shadow. Someone else was with him. My daughter's phone lit up. A text from my son. "Dad's not alone. And Mom, you need to know what he's been hiding in the basement. What he's been building. Get out now." The window glass started to crack. I didn't have time to think. My daughter's hand clamped around my wrist and yanked me backward as the window glass split into 100 tiny cracks spreading like a frozen spiderweb. The humming stopped and his voice came through the broken pane, smooth and calm like he was asking about dinner plans. "Girls, let's talk about this. I can explain everything if you just open the door." My legs wouldn't move, but my daughter dragged me across the living room toward her bedroom. The second shadow shifted closer to the window, and I felt my stomach twist because my son sent the warning, which meant he wasn't out there helping his father hunt us down. Someone else was with him. Someone who knew how to climb 7 stories and crack windows without breaking them completely. My daughter's phone was already at her ear while she shoved me through the bedroom doorway. "Yes, this is an emergency. Someone's trying to break into my apartment on the 7th floor. They're on the fire escape right now." Her voice came out steady, even though her hands shook so hard the phone rattled against her cheek. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, confused and asking how anyone could reach a seventh-floor window. The fire escape. They climbed the fire escape, my daughter said, pushing the bedroom door closed behind us. Metal groaned outside, a deep grinding sound like the ancient stairs couldn't hold the weight shifting across them. I pressed my hands over my mouth to keep from screaming, because that sound meant they were moving, getting closer or backing away. I couldn't tell which. My daughter locked the bedroom door and dragged her dresser in front of it while still talking to the dispatcher, giving the address twice and describing the cracked window. The humming started again, that terrible song drifting through the broken glass, and I wanted to throw up because he always hummed before he hurt me. The sound would start soft in the kitchen or hallway, getting louder as he got closer, and I'd have maybe 30 seconds to brace myself for whatever he'd decided I deserved. "They're still out there," my daughter whispered to the dispatcher, then to me. "Police are 4 minutes away." 4 minutes felt like forever when I could hear him humming through the walls. The metal groaning stopped suddenly, and the humming cut off mid-note. My daughter crept to her bedroom window and pulled the curtain back just an inch, peering down at the fire escape below. "They're leaving," she breathed, then louder into the phone. "The suspects are retreating down the fire escape, moving fast, but not running." She fumbled with her phone, switching to the camera while keeping the dispatcher on speaker. The click of the shutter sounded 3 times as she snapped photos through the gap in the curtain. I saw her squint at the screen, zooming in on blurry images of my husband's back and a shorter figure in dark clothes beside him. The shorter person wore a hood that hid their face completely. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second. My daughter kept the dispatcher on the line and moved back to photograph the cracked window from inside the bedroom. "I'm documenting everything," she told the dispatcher. "I have years of evidence against him already." The sirens got close enough that I could hear them turning onto our street. Car doors slammed outside and heavy footsteps pounded up the building's main stairs. My daughter ran to unlock the apartment door before the police had to break it down. 3 officers came through first, hands on their weapons as they swept through the tiny apartment, checking every corner and closet. One of them went straight to the window and radioed for backup when he saw the cracks spreading across the glass. "Fire escape access on the east side. Suspects fled approximately 3 minutes ago, requesting additional units to canvass the area." Another officer asked us to sit down and started taking our statement while the third one photographed the window damage from every angle. My daughter pulled out her laptop before they even asked, opening files and folders she'd organized with dates and categories. "I have documentation going back 6 years, she said, her voice stronger now that we weren't alone. "Videos, photos, medical records, everything." The officer's eyes went wide as she scrolled through thumbnail images of my husband screaming, throwing things, backing me into corners. "Ma'am, we're going to need detective support for this," he said into his radio. "Domestic violence situation with extensive evidence and attempted break-in." 20 minutes crawled by while we sat on the couch and more officers arrived to secure the scene. My daughter showed them the text from my son about the basement, and they radioed that information to someone else. Finally, a tall man with gray hair at his temples walked through the door, showing his badge and introducing himself as Detective Malachi Nolan. He sat down across from us and listened without interrupting while my daughter explained everything, showing him her organized files and the fresh photos of the shadows on the fire escape. He didn't tell us we were overreacting or suggest maybe it was a misunderstanding. He didn't minimize anything or look skeptical when my daughter described 20 years of escalating abuse. "Mrs. Sutherland, you're in danger and we're taking this seriously," he said, looking straight at me. "Your daughter's documentation is exactly what we need to move forward." I wanted to cry from relief because someone with authority finally believed us. Detective Nolan pulled out his own phone and showed my daughter the text from my son. "Tell me about this basement warning." My daughter's hands trembled as she pulled up the message and turned her screen toward him. "My brother sent this right before they appeared at the window. He says Dad's been hiding something down there, building something." The detective's jaw tightened as he read the message. "I'm sending officers to your house right now with a warrant." The threat combined with attempted breaking and entering gives us legal grounds to search the property. He made a call that lasted 30 seconds, authorizing the search and telling someone to bring bolt cutters for the basement lock. I felt sick thinking about what they'd find down there because my husband spent hours in that basement with the door locked, and I'd never been allowed to ask questions. 20 years of him disappearing into that space while I stayed upstairs, and now I'd find out what he was doing all that time. "You can't stay here," Detective Nolan said, looking around the small apartment. "He knows this location and he'll come back. We need to move you somewhere safe tonight." He made another call, this time asking for someone named Sylvia Sanderson, best domestic violence advocate in the city. "She'll coordinate emergency housing and get you set up with resources." My daughter gripped my hand while we waited for this Sylvia person to arrive. Less than an hour later, a woman in her 50s knocked on the door, introducing herself with a warm smile that didn't hide the efficiency in her eyes. She was already pulling out her phone and making calls while asking us gentle questions about what we needed right now. "Do you have medications, important documents, anything you can't leave behind?" My daughter grabbed her laptop and charger while I realized I had nothing but the clothes I'd thrown in a grocery bag hours ago. We need to disappear completely tonight, Sylvia explained while typing rapidly on her phone. Your husband knowing this address makes it unsafe, and we have secure locations specifically for high-risk situations like yours. She arranged everything in 15 minutes, talking to someone named Richard who would drive us to the safe house. Detective Nolan stayed until a man in his 60s arrived, introducing himself as Sylvia's husband and a retired police officer. Richard had kind eyes, but moved like someone who'd spent decades watching for danger. We're taking a complicated route, he said, leading us down to his car in the building's garage. Multiple turns, backtracking, the whole thing. Nobody's following us tonight. My daughter clutched her laptop against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I climbed into the back seat and Richard pulled out of the garage slowly, checking his mirrors constantly. We drove through the city taking random turns that made no sense, doubling back on streets we'd already passed, stopping at red lights long after they turned green to see if any cars behind us did the same. My daughter kept turning around to look through the rear window, her face pale in the streetlights flashing past. The city gave way to suburbs and Richard's route got even more twisted, turning down residential streets and circling blocks until I was completely lost. 40 minutes after leaving my daughter's apartment, we pulled up to a plain ranch house with a neat lawn, and nothing special about it except the security cameras mounted at every corner. Richard got out first and checked the perimeter before letting us exit the car. The front door had 3 locks and a reinforced frame that looked like it could withstand a battering ram. Safe house, Richard explained, unlocking all 3 locks with separate keys. Reinforced doors, security cameras with remote monitoring. Neighbors are all retired cops who watch out for each other. The inside was basic, but clean, with donated furniture that didn't match and walls painted beige. Sylvia appeared 20 minutes later carrying bags from the pharmacy and grocery store. She made tea while my daughter and I sat frozen on the couch, unable to process that we'd escaped but were also running for our lives. The shelter system works like this, Sylvia said gently, setting mugs in front of us. You stay here tonight while we arrange longer-term housing. Detective Nolan will update us on the investigation and will coordinate with lawyers and counselors. You're not alone in this. I kept expecting to hear that humming, kept waiting for my husband to appear in the doorway with that calm expression he wore before he exploded. Sylvia stayed with us through the evening, explaining resources and making plans while my daughter and I sat, shell-shocked. At 2 a.m, my phone rang with Detective Nolan's number on the screen. Mrs. Sutherland, I need to tell you what we found in your basement. His voice sounded tight and controlled. Officers discovered a workshop filled with surveillance equipment, computers, monitors showing live feeds from cameras throughout your house. There are detailed schedules tracking your daughter's movements for the past 6 months, maps of her apartment building with notes about security vulnerabilities, a handwritten plan outlining how to retrieve you. My blood turned to ice in my veins. We also found documents showing your husband accessed your daughter's lease application and employment records somehow. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the image of him sitting in that basement watching my daughter's every move and planning how to get me back. There's more, Detective Nolan said, and his voice got even tighter. We had to pull up some floorboards because we found evidence of disturbed concrete. Mrs. Sutherland, we discovered identity documents, credit cards, and bank statements for 3 different women you've never heard of. Your husband has been systematically stealing identities and building false financial profiles for years. This is federal crime territory now. I hung up the phone with Detective Nolan and sat frozen on the safe house couch, trying to process that my husband had been stealing identities for years. My daughter squeezed my hand, but neither of us could speak. Sylvia made more tea that nobody drank while Richard checked the security cameras again. The doorbell rang at 8 the next morning, and I jumped so hard I knocked over my cold mug. Richard checked the monitor and nodded before opening the door to reveal my son standing between 2 police officers. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes red and his clothes wrinkled. Detective Nolan stepped in behind him and dismissed the officers with a nod. My son walked toward me slowly, his hands shaking, and I stood to hug him, but he stopped a few feet away. He pulled out his phone and set it on the coffee table, then sat down heavily in the armchair across from us. Detective Nolan stayed by the door, giving us space but watching carefully. My son started talking in a flat, exhausted voice about searching for old family photos 2 weeks ago to make a slideshow for his graduation. He'd gone into the basement looking for boxes of pictures, and found the locked workshop door standing open for the first time in years. Inside were the computers and monitors, the detailed schedules tracking my daughter's every movement, the notebooks filled with observations about her routines. He'd frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing, then heard footsteps on the stairs and barely managed to hide behind some filing cabinets before his father came down. He watched through a crack as his father sat at the computer and pulled up live camera feeds from our house, watching me fold laundry in the bedroom. His father had opened a notebook and written down the time I finished and what room I went to next. My son waited until his father left for work the next day, then went back down with his phone and photographed everything he could. He showed us the pictures now, hundreds of them, documenting the surveillance equipment and the handwritten logs. There were notebooks going back 6 months for my daughter, tracking when she left for work, when she came home, what groceries she bought, who visited her apartment. Another set of notebooks tracked me with even more detail, noting what I wore each day, what I cooked, how long I spent in each room, whether I smiled or seemed upset. My son's voice cracked as he scrolled to photos of a large wall map showing my daughter's apartment building, with notes about security cameras, fire escape access, and the building superintendent's schedule. There were receipts stapled to pages showing payments to someone named Larry Webb for surveillance services, thousands of dollars over the past 3 months. My daughter grabbed the phone and zoomed in on one receipt, her face going pale. The date was from last week, the same day she'd noticed someone following her home from the grocery store. She'd convinced herself she was being paranoid, but now we knew she'd been right. Detective Nolan stepped forward and asked to see the photos, then made a call on his phone while looking through them. He spoke quietly to someone about surveillance evidence and private investigator records, then hung up and told us the FBI would want copies of everything. My son explained he'd been paralyzed with fear after finding the workshop, unable to decide whether telling me would put me in more danger, or whether staying silent made him responsible for whatever his father planned next. He'd finally sent that warning text when he saw his father leaving the house with a duffel bag and heard him on the phone giving someone an address that he realized was my daughter's building. Detective Nolan's phone rang and he stepped outside to answer it. My son kept apologizing, saying he should have called the police immediately, but he'd been too scared of what his father might do. My daughter moved to sit beside him and took his hand, telling him he'd saved us by sending that text. He'd given us the warning we needed to call for help before his father got inside the apartment. Sylvia brought coffee and sat with us while we waited for Detective Nolan to return. When he came back in, his expression was grim but satisfied. The FBI was officially taking over the identity theft investigation and would be filing federal charges within 24 hours. The state was moving forward with stalking, breaking, and entering and assault charges. My husband would be arrested at his workplace tomorrow morning because they wanted to catch him off guard and search his office computers. The private investigator Larry Webb was already in custody after officers picked him up at his apartment an hour ago. Webb had a record of crossing legal lines for clients and faced his own charges for stalking and conspiracy. Detective Nolan said Webb was already talking, trying to cut a deal by giving up information about my husband's plans. Apparently, my husband had paid him to find vulnerabilities in my daughter's security and had been planning to break into her apartment for weeks. Sylvia made another call while Detective Nolan was talking, stepping into the kitchen and speaking in low tones. She came back and told me she'd arranged a meeting with a divorce lawyer named Luca Crowder, who specialized in high-risk cases involving abuse and financial crimes. Luca could see us this afternoon at her office downtown, and Sylvia would drive us there. I felt overwhelmed by how fast everything was moving, from running out of my daughter's apartment to sitting in a safe house learning my husband was a criminal who'd been planning to kidnap me. Sylvia sat beside me and explained gently that we needed to move quickly while my husband was in custody and before he could hide assets or intimidate witnesses. The next few days would be intense, but she'd be with us through all of it. Richard offered to stay at the safe house with my son while we met with the lawyer, giving him a chance to rest and process everything. My son looked grateful and exhausted, slumping back in the chair like all his energy had drained away. My daughter and I got ready to leave, and I felt strange putting on clean clothes that Sylvia had bought for me yesterday since I'd left my house with nothing but what I was wearing. The lawyer's office was in a modern building downtown with security guards and key card access to the upper floors. Luca met us in the lobby, a tall woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a firm handshake. She led us to a conference room with a view of the city and closed the door before sitting across from us with a yellow legal pad. She asked direct questions about our marriage, my husband's control tactics, the financial arrangements, and what assets we had. I realized with growing shame that I couldn't answer most of her questions about money. I didn't know what bank accounts we had or how much money was in them. I didn't know if we owned our house outright or had a mortgage. I didn't know about retirement accounts or investments or insurance policies. My husband had handled everything and given me a small amount of cash each week for groceries, taking the receipts and change when I got home. Luca wrote everything down without judgment, then explained that this level of financial control was economic abuse and would strengthen our case. She said my husband's arrest was coming and we could file for emergency divorce immediately with a protective order. The criminal charges would support our request, and judges took these situations seriously. She asked detailed questions about our finances that I couldn't answer, but she said we'd subpoena bank records and force my husband to disclose everything during discovery. My daughter pulled out her laptop and showed Luca the documentation she'd been compiling for years. Luca spent 30 minutes reviewing the videos and timeline, occasionally pausing to take notes or ask questions. When she finished, she sat back and told my daughter this was the most thorough documentation she'd ever seen in an abuse case. Most victims had little or no evidence because abuse happened in private, but we had years of recorded incidents with dates and context. She explained that abuse cases often failed in court because it became he said, she said, but our evidence made the legal case much stronger. We had proof of the pattern, the escalation, the systematic control. Luca said she'd file the emergency divorce petition tomorrow and request a 5-year restraining order. She'd cite the criminal charges and documented abuse, and she was confident the judge would grant both quickly. My husband would be ordered to have no contact with me, our children, or anyone associated with us. She asked about our assets again, and I admitted I knew almost nothing about our money. Luca said that was common in financial abuse cases, and we'd figure it out through legal discovery. She asked if I had any income or accounts in my name, and I shook my head, feeling the weight of 20 years of dependence. My daughter squeezed my hand and reminded me that we were fixing this now, that I'd be independent soon. Luca walked us through the likely timeline, explaining that the divorce could be finalized in a few months given the circumstances, but the criminal trial would take longer. She asked if I was willing to testify against my husband, and I felt my stomach turn at the thought of facing him in court. Luca said I didn't have to decide now, but the prosecutor would probably ask. We left her office with a folder full of paperwork to review and sign, and Sylvia drove us back to the safe house. 3 days passed in a strange blur of meetings and phone calls and paperwork. Detective Nolan called to tell us the FBI had arrested my husband at his workplace that morning. He'd tried to run when agents approached him in the parking lot, but they'd caught him within seconds. He'd immediately started yelling that he was framed by his mentally unstable wife, who'd poisoned their children against him. The agents had searched his car and found 3 burner phones, 2 fake driver's licenses, and a folder containing surveillance photos of my daughter. They'd searched his office and found more evidence of identity theft and financial fraud on his work computer. My son stayed at the safe house with us, unable to go back to his apartment, because reporters had found his address and were camped outside. The story had hit the news because of the scope of the identity theft and my husband's position as a senior manager at a respected company. My son was angry that his father's public reputation had always been a lie, that everyone saw him as successful and respectable while he was terrorizing his family at home. He broke down crying one afternoon while my daughter and I were making lunch, apologizing over and over for not helping me sooner. He said he'd suspected the abuse but convinced himself it wasn't that bad because I never left, never called the police, never asked for help. He'd been too scared to intervene, and now he felt responsible for all those years I'd suffered. My daughter hugged him and told him firmly that he'd been a child living in the same abusive household, that he couldn't have saved me when he was just trying to survive himself. She said what mattered was that he'd warned us when it counted, that his text had given us time to call for help. I held both my children and realized they'd been carrying trauma from growing up in our poisoned household, that my husband's abuse had damaged all of us in different ways. Sylvia connected me with a therapist named Ingrid Davis, who specialized in trauma recovery for domestic abuse survivors. Ingrid's office was in a quiet building with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that didn't feel clinical. She didn't push me to talk about the abuse right away, instead focusing on immediate coping strategies for the panic attacks that hit me randomly throughout each day. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques, ways to calm my body when it went into fight or flight mode. She explained that my nervous system had been on high alert for 20 years, and it would take time to feel safe again. The prosecutor assigned to my husband's case called and asked to meet with us to explain the charges and timeline. She came to the safe house instead of making us go to her office, a consideration I appreciated. She spread out documents on the dining table and walked us through the federal charges of identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy, plus the state charges of stalking, breaking and entering, and assault. She said she was confident about conviction given the evidence, but warned that trials could take 8 to 12 months. She asked if I was willing to testify, and I felt physically ill at the thought of facing my husband in court, of having him stare at me while I described what he'd done. The prosecutor said I didn't have to decide immediately, but my testimony would make the case stronger. Luca filed the emergency divorce petition and restraining order request, and we got a court date within 48 hours. The judge reviewed the criminal charges and my daughter's documentation, then granted both requests from the bench. My husband was ordered to have 0 contact with me, our children, or anyone associated with us for 5 years. He was denied bail because the judge agreed he was a flight risk given the fake IDs and the severity of the charges. Luca told me this was a major victory, that getting bail denied was difficult, but the evidence was overwhelming. I sat in that courtroom and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, knowing I was finally free but grieving all the wasted years. Luca sat across from me at her office desk 3 days after the restraining order hearing, her expression serious as she pulled out financial documents I'd never seen before. She explained that my husband had opened credit cards in my name without my knowledge, taken out loans using my social security number, and transferred money between accounts I didn't know existed. I stared at the papers feeling sick because I had nothing. No bank account, no credit history that was actually mine, no proof I'd ever worked or earned money. 20 years of marriage and I owned nothing, had access to nothing, existed on paper as someone who'd never had a job or income. Luca said I was entitled to half of everything in the divorce, but my husband had hidden most of our assets in offshore accounts and shell companies that would take months to track down. She showed me bank statements revealing he'd been moving money systematically for at least 5 years, preparing for the day I might try to leave. The financial abuse was just as calculated as everything else, designed to keep me dependent and trapped even if I managed to escape physically. I felt stupid for not knowing, for never questioning why I needed his permission to buy groceries, or why I couldn't have my own bank card. Luca reminded me firmly that this wasn't my fault, that he'd deliberately kept me isolated and ignorant about our finances as part of his control. She said we'd fight for every dollar I was owed, but warned it would be a long process because he'd been planning his financial fortress for years. Sylvia arrived at the safe house that afternoon with a stack of paperwork for emergency assistance programs I'd never heard of. She helped me fill out applications for food stamps, temporary cash assistance, and Medicaid because I had no health insurance in my own name. I signed forms with shaking hands, feeling ashamed that I needed government help at 52 years old with a master's degree from Princeton. Sylvia sensed my humiliation and stopped me halfway through the third application, looking me directly in the eyes. She said my husband had deliberately destroyed my independence and career specifically, so I'd feel this shame if I ever tried to leave. The humiliation I felt right now was part of his design, another weapon he'd used to keep me trapped. She reminded me I'd been a successful accountant with Fortune 500 job offers before he made me quit 3 days after our wedding. This wasn't my failure, it was his calculated abuse, and accepting help now was how I'd rebuild what he'd stolen. Sylvia also connected me with job training programs designed for domestic violence survivors, classes that would update my accounting skills and help me re-enter the workforce after 20 years. She showed me brochures for programs that understood gaps in employment history and specialized in helping women like me restart careers our abusers had destroyed. My daughter insisted on paying for everything while the legal process dragged forward, using the money she'd been secretly saving since she was 16. She covered groceries, clothes, toiletries, anything I needed while I waited for emergency assistance to process. I was grateful but also devastated watching her spend money she'd earned working through college and her first years out of school. She should have used that money for travel, a better apartment, starting her own life, not funding her mother's escape from abuse. I tried to refuse, but she got angry, her voice sharp as she reminded me she'd been planning this rescue for 3 years. Every dollar she'd saved had been earmarked for getting me out safely, for making sure I could survive once I finally left. She said she'd worked extra shifts, skipped vacations, lived cheaply specifically so she'd have enough money to support me when the moment came. Saving me was worth every sacrifice, every missed opportunity, every dollar she'd set aside instead of spending on herself. My daughter looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she'd spend every cent she had if it meant I never had to go back to that house. I hugged her and sobbed because she'd spent her 20s planning my rescue instead of just being young and free. Ingrid's therapy office became a safe space where I could process truths I'd been avoiding for 20 years. She helped me understand that my husband was a criminal who'd targeted me specifically because I was successful and educated. He saw my Princeton degree and job offers as a challenge, something he needed to break down and destroy. The abuse wasn't about me being inadequate or failing as a wife. It was about his psychological need to dominate and control someone competent. Ingrid explained that abusers often target strong, accomplished women because breaking them down provides a bigger sense of power. My intelligence and success weren't flaws that caused the abuse. They were exactly what attracted him because destroying those qualities fed his need for control. She walked me through, recognizing that nothing I could have done differently would have prevented his abuse because it was never about my behavior. He would have found reasons to hurt me regardless because the abuse served his psychological needs, not any actual failing on my part. Ingrid said understanding this distinction was crucial for my recovery because I'd spent 20 years believing I'd caused his violence by being imperfect. The truth was he'd chosen me specifically to destroy, and recognizing that helped me stop blaming myself. Detective Nolan called with an update about the FBI investigation that made my stomach turn. They'd discovered my husband had been stealing identities primarily from women, using their information to create credit card debt and open fraudulent accounts. The victims were all successful professionals, lawyers, doctors, accountants, executives, women who reminded him of me. He'd been victimizing strangers from a distance, destroying their credit and financial security the same way he destroyed mine at home. The FBI found detailed files where he'd researched these women, collecting information about their careers and accomplishments before stealing their identities. Detective Nolan said it appeared my husband had an obsession with controlling and harming successful women that extended far beyond our marriage. I felt sick knowing his need to dominate me had spread to hurting innocent strangers who'd never even met him. These women were suffering because of his twisted fixation, their lives disrupted because they reminded him of the wife he was systematically breaking down. The scope of his criminal behavior kept expanding, revealing layers of calculated cruelty I'd never imagined. Detective Nolan assured me the FBI was working to identify all the victims and help them recover, but the damage my husband had caused would take years to fully undo. The investigation into my husband's accomplice revealed another disturbing layer to his surveillance network. Detective Nolan discovered the private investigator who'd helped my husband track our daughter had been arrested separately for stalking multiple clients' targets. This man had a history of crossing legal boundaries, installing illegal cameras, breaking into homes, threatening people who got too close to his surveillance subjects. He faced his own criminal charges, including stalking, harassment, breaking and entering, and violations of privacy laws. Detective Nolan explained that my husband had hired someone with a documented pattern of illegal behavior, someone willing to do whatever it took to track and intimidate his targets. The investigator's arrest meant prosecutors could build a stronger case against my husband for conspiracy and hiring someone to commit crimes. His entire accomplice network was crumbling as investigators dug deeper, finding more people he'd paid to help him control and monitor our family. Each new arrest revealed how extensive his surveillance system had been, how many people he'd involved in his obsessive need to track and dominate us. My son showed up at the safe house 2 weeks after my husband's arrest, carrying a duffel bag and looking exhausted. He couldn't stay at his apartment anymore because reporters had found him, camping outside his building and shouting questions every time he left for work. The media had picked up the story because of the identity theft scope and my husband's respected position at his company. News outlets were running pieces about the successful executive who'd been secretly abusing his family and stealing identities for years. My son was angry that his father's public reputation had always been a lie, that everyone saw him as a respected professional, while we knew the truth about his violence. He talked about coworkers expressing shock and disbelief, people who'd worked with his father for years refusing to believe the charges. My son said it made him furious that strangers defended his father while dismissing the evidence of what he'd done to us. He moved into the safe house temporarily, sleeping on the couch while reporters continued hounding him. We'd become a story. Our private nightmare turned into public entertainment, and my son struggled with the exposure after years of keeping family secrets. Luca called with news that felt like a small victory in the middle of chaos. She'd successfully frozen all marital assets so my husband couldn't hide more money while awaiting trial. The court had granted her emergency motion after reviewing evidence of his offshore accounts and systematic financial abuse. Luca discovered he had over $400,000 in various accounts, money I never knew existed. He'd told me for 20 years that we were barely getting by, that we couldn't afford things I wanted, that money was always tight. Meanwhile, he'd been hoarding cash and controlling every penny I could access while building a secret fortune. Luca found checking accounts, savings accounts, investment accounts, all in his name only or hidden in shell companies. She showed me statements going back 15 years, proof he'd been systematically hiding money throughout our marriage. I looked at the numbers feeling numb because we could have been comfortable, could have taken vacations, could have helped our kids with college, but instead he'd kept everything locked away while making me beg for grocery money. The financial abuse was staggering in its scope and cruelty. The nightmare started 3 weeks after leaving, vivid dreams that woke me screaming in the middle of the night. I relived the boiling water incident, feeling phantom burns on my arms while my husband stood over me, explaining I deserved the pain. I dreamed about falling down the stairs, his hands on my back pushing me forward. I saw the locked bedroom door from the inside, 3 days of isolation replaying in horrible detail. Hundreds of other moments I'd buried or minimized came flooding back in sleep, memories my brain had suppressed to help me survive. I'd wake up gasping, unable to tell what was real, my daughter rushing in to hold me while I sobbed. Ingrid explained this was normal, that my nervous system was finally processing trauma it couldn't handle while I was still living in danger. She said the nightmares were horrible, but also evidence that I was safe enough now for my brain to remember and process what had happened. My body was catching up to reality, working through years of stored fear and pain now that the immediate threat had passed. Ingrid taught me grounding techniques for when I woke up terrified, ways to remind myself I was in the safe house and not back in that bedroom, or at the bottom of those stairs. Autumn Gallegos arrived at the safe house with information about transitioning to more permanent housing. She was a coordinator who worked with the shelter system, specializing in placing high-risk domestic violence survivors in secure apartments. Autumn explained she'd found a building specifically designed for women like me, with cameras at all entries, secured access requiring key cards, and a landlord who partnered with victim services. The apartment had 2 bedrooms so my daughter could stay with me, reinforced locks on all doors and windows, and was located in a neighborhood my husband didn't know. Autumn walked us through the application process, helping me fill out forms, even though I had no rental history, no employment, no credit in my own name. She said the landlord understood the circumstances and worked regularly with survivors who needed safe housing while rebuilding their lives. The building had other women in similar situations, a small community of people who understood what we'd been through. Autumn scheduled a viewing for the next day, and I felt a spark of hope at the thought of having my own space for the first time in 20 years. A place I could choose, where I could decide what went on the walls, what food filled the kitchen, how I spent my time. My daughter squeezed my hand as Autumn described the apartment, both of us imagining a future where we weren't just hiding, but actually living. The next morning, my daughter drove us to a furniture store downtown. I hadn't been shopping without my husband's supervision in 20 years. My hands shook as we walked through the automatic doors into the bright showroom filled with couches and tables and lamps. She grabbed a cart and pushed it toward the bedroom section, talking about what we'd need for the new apartment. I followed behind her, overwhelmed by the simple act of being allowed to look at things without asking permission first. We moved through the displays slowly, my daughter pointing out different styles and asking what I liked. I couldn't answer at first because I didn't know what I liked. My husband had chosen everything in our house, every plate and towel and piece of furniture, all picked to his exact specifications. The few times I'd suggested something different, he'd exploded about my terrible taste and my attempts to waste his money on garbage. Now my daughter was asking me to choose, and I stood frozen in the lamp section, unable to decide between two basic table lamps because the fear of choosing wrong was so deep. She touched my arm gently and said we could come back another day if this was too much. But I shook my head and forced myself to point at the lamp with the blue base. She put it in the cart without judgment or criticism, and we kept moving. We reached the kitchen section 30 minutes later, and that's when I completely fell apart. Rows of dishes in every color and pattern, cups and bowls and plates I could actually pick myself. My daughter was looking at a white set with little flowers when I saw the plain blue dishes on the shelf below. Something about that simple blue made my chest tight. For 20 years, I'd eaten off the plates my husband chose, heavy white ones that he said were the only acceptable style for a proper home. He'd screamed at me once for suggesting we get new dishes after I chipped one, calling me wasteful and stupid for even thinking about spending money on something so unnecessary. Now I reached out and touched the blue plate, running my fingers over the smooth surface. My daughter noticed and came over, asking if I liked those ones. I nodded, unable to speak, because tears were already streaming down my face. She didn't ask why I was crying. She just started loading the blue dishes into our cart, every plate and bowl and cup in that pattern. I sobbed in the middle of the store while other shoppers walked past, probably thinking I was crazy for breaking down over dishes. But these weren't just dishes. They were the first things I'd chosen for myself in 2 decades. My daughter finished loading the cart, and then wrapped her arms around me, holding me while I cried. She whispered that we were building a new life together, one choice at a time, and every single choice was mine to make. We spent 3 more hours in that store, picking out towels and sheets and kitchen supplies. Every time I hesitated or looked scared, my daughter reminded me that there were no wrong answers, no punishments for choosing incorrectly. By the time we loaded everything into her car, I was exhausted, but also felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of believing I deserved to have preferences and make decisions. 6 weeks passed before the preliminary hearing. Luca called to confirm the date and asked if I wanted to attend. I didn't want to see my husband at all, but she explained that my presence might help the judge understand the severity of the situation. Detective Nolan offered to drive me to the courthouse, and my daughter took the day off work to come with us. I barely slept the night before, having nightmares about my husband escaping from jail and finding me. The morning of the hearing, I put on the clothes my daughter had bought me, a simple gray dress that I'd chosen myself from a department store. We arrived at the courthouse early, and Luca met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. She reviewed what would happen during the hearing and reminded me that I didn't have to speak unless the judge asked me a direct question. Detective Nolan stood nearby, his presence somehow making me feel safer even though I knew my husband was already in custody. When they called our case, we filed into the courtroom and took seats behind the prosecutor's table. I kept my eyes down, focusing on my hands folded in my lap. Then I heard the side door open and the shuffle of chains. I looked up and saw my husband being led in by 2 guards. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him and his ankles shackled together. His hair was messy and he'd lost weight, making his face look sharper and meaner than I remembered. I thought seeing him powerless and restrained would feel good, like justice or victory or relief. Instead, I just felt sad. Sad for all the years I wasted believing his lies. Sad for the life I could have had if I'd left sooner. Sad that this man I'd once loved had never actually loved me at all. My husband's eyes scanned the courtroom and landed on me. His expression changed immediately, filling with hatred so pure and intense that I physically recoiled in my seat. My daughter grabbed my hand and squeezed hard. He stared at me while the guards positioned him next to his lawyer, his mouth curling into something between a smile and a snarl. That look told me everything I needed to know. He didn't regret hurting me. He didn't feel remorse for the abuse or the crimes or the fear he'd caused. He was angry that I'd escaped, furious that I'd dared to leave him and expose what he'd done. The judge entered and everyone stood. My legs shook so badly I had to grip the bench in front of me for support. Luca had warned me this would just be a preliminary hearing, not a trial. But being in the same room with my husband made my whole body remember every time he'd hurt me. The judge reviewed the charges while my husband's lawyer shuffled papers and whispered to his client. When the judge finished, my husband's lawyer stood and immediately launched into an argument for bail reduction. He claimed my husband was a respected member of the community with strong ties to the area, a steady employment history, and no prior criminal record. He argued that the charges were based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of an unreliable witness, meaning me, and that his client deserved the opportunity to prepare his defense from home rather than jail. He made my husband sound like an upstanding citizen being persecuted by a vengeful wife who'd fabricated abuse claims to get a better divorce settlement. I felt sick listening to him twist everything into lies. The prosecutor stood up before the judge could respond. She was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and her voice was calm but firm as she addressed the court. She laid out the evidence systematically, starting with the surveillance equipment found in my husband's basement. She described the detailed schedules tracking my daughter's movements, the photographs taken from multiple angles of her apartment building, the notebooks documenting her daily routine down to the minute. Then she moved on to the identity theft evidence, explaining how investigators had found documents for 3 different women hidden under the basement floorboards. She presented the fake IDs discovered in my husband's car during his arrest, the burner phones with no legitimate purpose, and the detailed escape plans found in his home office. The prosecutor pulled out enlarged photos showing the basement workshop, and I saw my husband's face tighten with anger as she displayed his secret surveillance operation for the whole courtroom to see. She finished by noting that my husband had attempted to flee when federal agents approached him for arrest, demonstrating clear consciousness of guilt and flight risk. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When the prosecutor finished, he looked at my husband's lawyer and asked if he had anything to add. The lawyer tried to argue that the basement workshop was just a hobby, that his client was interested in security systems as an intellectual exercise. It sounded ridiculous even as he said it. The judge's expression didn't change. He reviewed his notes for what felt like forever, the courtroom completely silent except for the sound of pages turning. Finally, he looked up and denied the bail reduction request. He stated that the evidence presented demonstrated both flight risk and danger to the community, particularly to me and my family. He ordered my husband to remain in custody pending trial. That's when my husband exploded. He lunged forward against his restraints, screaming that I was a liar and a whore who'd poisoned everyone against him. He yelled that he'd done everything for me, given me everything, and this was how I repaid him. The guards grabbed him immediately, but he kept shouting as they dragged him toward the side door. He locked eyes with me one last time and his voice dropped to something cold and threatening. He said this wasn't over, that I'd never be free of him, that he'd make sure I regretted leaving. Then the guards pulled him through the door and he was gone. The judge called for order and dismissed the hearing. My whole body was shaking, my daughter's hand still gripping mine so hard it hurt. Luca turned around and told me I'd done well just by being there. Detective Nolan walked us out through a back exit to avoid any reporters who might be waiting in the main hallway. 2 weeks later, Sylvia called and asked if I'd be interested in volunteering at the domestic violence shelter. She explained they needed help with intake paperwork and resource navigation, tasks that didn't require formal training but made a huge difference for women arriving in crisis. I agreed immediately, grateful for something productive to do with my time while waiting for the divorce to finalize and the criminal trial to proceed. My first day at the shelter was intimidating. The building was plain and unmarked from the outside, security cameras monitoring every entrance. Sylvia met me at the door and walked me through the facility, showing me the common areas, the children's playroom, and the small offices where staff met with residents. She introduced me to other volunteers and staff members, explaining my background briefly so I wouldn't have to repeat my story over and over. Then she took me to the intake office and showed me the forms women filled out when they first arrived, applications for emergency assistance, restraining order paperwork, housing applications, medical release forms. The stack of documents was overwhelming even for me with my accounting background. Sylvia explained that most women arrived traumatized and exhausted, often with children, and trying to navigate this bureaucracy while in crisis was nearly impossible. My job was to sit with them, explain each form clearly, help them fill everything out accurately, and make sure they didn't miss any crucial steps. My first client arrived an hour later. She was younger than me, maybe 30, with a black eye and a split lip that was still bleeding slightly. She had 2 small kids with her, both under 5, and she looked so scared and lost that I wanted to cry just seeing her. I introduced myself and explained I was there to help with paperwork. She nodded and sat down, her hands shaking as she tried to hold the pen I offered. We worked through the forms slowly. I asked questions gently and wrote down her answers when her hands shook too much to write herself. She told me about her husband's violence, the escalation over 5 years, the moment last night when she'd realized he might actually kill her if she stayed. Her story sounded so familiar. Different details, but the same pattern of control and abuse and fear. When we finished the paperwork, she looked at me and asked how long I'd been volunteering. I told her this was my first day, but I'd left my own abusive husband 2 months ago. Her eyes filled with tears and she asked if it got better. I thought about my answer carefully before responding. I told her it got different, and different was better than the hell she'd been living in. She nodded and thanked me. Then Sylvia came to show her to her room. Over the next few weeks, I met dozens of women. Different ages, different backgrounds, different specific stories, but the core pattern was always the same. Isolation, control, escalating violence, and a manipulator who'd convinced them they deserved the abuse or couldn't survive without him. These women were smart and capable and strong. One was a nurse, another was a teacher, one had been a successful real estate agent before her husband forced her to quit. They weren't weak or stupid or uniquely broken. They were victims of skilled manipulators who'd systematically destroyed their independence and self-worth, just like me. Sharing my story with them and hearing theirs helped me understand I wasn't alone. The shame I'd been carrying started to lift, because I could see clearly that the abuse wasn't my fault, wasn't about my inadequacy, wasn't something I'd caused or deserved. My husband had targeted me specifically because I was successful and educated, viewing my competence as a challenge to break down. These other women had been targeted for similar reasons by men who needed to dominate and control. We were survivors of a specific type of predator, and there was no shame in having been victimized by someone who'd made manipulation their life's work. My son started therapy the same week I began volunteering. He'd been resistant at first, insisting he was fine and didn't need help processing his childhood, but after the preliminary hearing, where he'd watched his father's violent outburst and heard the details of the surveillance operation, something shifted. He called me one night and admitted he'd been having panic attacks and couldn't sleep. He felt guilty for not protecting me, angry at himself for being too scared to intervene, confused about which childhood memories were real versus the sanitized version his father had insisted on. I gave him the name of Ingrid's colleague, a therapist who worked specifically with adult children of abusive parents. His first session was difficult. The therapist asked him to describe his childhood, and my son realized he'd spent 20 years minimizing and rationalizing his father's behavior. He'd told himself the yelling was normal, the control was just old-fashioned parenting, the fear was his own weakness rather than a reasonable response to living with a volatile abuser. Admitting the truth meant accepting that his entire childhood had been shaped by violence and manipulation, and that realization was devastating. My daughter joined some of his sessions after the therapist suggested family therapy might help them process their shared trauma. They sat together in the therapist's office and finally talked honestly about growing up in our house. My daughter described watching me get hurt and feeling powerless to stop it, spending her teenage years documenting abuse and planning my rescue because she knew I couldn't save myself. My son talked about the pressure to be perfect, to never upset his father, to pretend everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't. They both cried about the childhood they'd lost, the normal family experiences they'd never had, the constant fear that had colored every memory. But they also supported each other in ways they couldn't before. My daughter stopped resenting my son for not helping sooner, understanding that he'd been just as trapped and scared as I was. My son stopped feeling guilty about his sister's burden, recognizing that she'd made her own choices about how to respond to our family situation. They started meeting for lunch once a week outside of therapy, rebuilding their sibling relationship without the weight of their father's presence poisoning every interaction. Luca called 6 weeks after the preliminary hearing with news about the divorce settlement. She'd been negotiating with my husband's lawyer, and they'd finally reached an agreement. Because my husband's criminal activity and financial abuse were so well documented, his lawyer knew they couldn't win a contested divorce. My husband was also too focused on his criminal defense to put energy into fighting the divorce settlement. Luca had pushed for 70% of marital assets, arguing that I'd been systematically prevented from earning income or building my own financial security for 20 years. My husband's lawyer had tried to negotiate down to 50-50, but Luca had held firm. She'd presented evidence of the hidden bank accounts, the money my husband had hoarded while telling me we were barely getting by, the financial control that had left me completely dependent. Eventually, his lawyer agreed to the 70-30 split. Luca explained the numbers carefully. Total marital assets came to just over $400,000. After the split, I'd receive approximately $280,000 once everything was finalized. My husband would get the remaining $120,000, though most of that would likely go toward his legal defense for the criminal charges. The house would be sold and proceeds divided according to the same percentage. I'd also receive a portion of his retirement accounts and pension. The settlement included provisions ensuring I'd receive my share even if my husband was convicted and sent to prison. Luca warned that final processing might take several months, but the agreement was legally binding now that both parties had signed. I cried when she told me the amount. $280,000. It wasn't enough to make up for 20 years of abuse, but it was enough to rebuild my life. Enough for a security deposit on a decent apartment, enough to live on while I looked for work, enough to give me breathing room to heal and recover without immediate financial panic. My daughter hugged me when I told her the news. She'd been supporting me financially since I left, using her savings to pay for my food and clothes and therapy sessions. Now I'd be able to pay her back and stand on my own feet. The money represented more than just financial security. It represented independence, the ability to make my own choices without depending on anyone else's approval or generosity. I enrolled in an accounting refresher course at the community college the following week. My degree from Princeton was 20 years old, and accounting practices had changed significantly since I'd worked in the field. The course met twice a week in the evenings, covering updated software programs, new tax regulations, and modern bookkeeping systems. Walking into that first class was terrifying. I was 52 years old, surrounded by students half my age who'd grown up with technology I'd been forbidden to use. The professor was a kind woman in her 60s who introduced herself and explained the course structure. She asked each student to share their background and goals. When my turn came, I said simply that I was returning to accounting after a long absence and needed to update my skills. The other students nodded, and the professor moved on without pressing for details. The coursework was challenging, but not impossible. I'd been so afraid that 20 years away had erased everything I'd learned that my husband had been right when he called me stupid and incompetent. But as the professor explained concepts and walked through examples, I found myself understanding immediately. The core principles hadn't changed. Debits and credits, balance sheets, income statements. My brain still knew how to process financial information and spot errors. The software was new and the specific procedures had evolved, but the fundamental logic was still there. I stayed after class to ask the professor questions about one of the software programs. She answered patiently and then asked if I'd like to join a study group some of the older students had formed. I agreed, grateful for the chance to connect with people who wouldn't judge my circumstances. The study group met at the library on Saturday mornings. There were 4 of us, all returning to work after various life interruptions. One woman had taken 15 years off to raise kids, another had left a career to care for aging parents. The third had been laid off and was retraining for a new field. We worked through practice problems together and helped each other with the software modules. Nobody asked why I'd been away from work for 20 years, and I didn't volunteer the information. For those few hours each week, I was just another student trying to rebuild a career. Detective Nolan called one afternoon with an update about the identity theft investigation. The FBI had identified 12 victims whose information my husband had stolen and used to create fraudulent accounts. They were working to restore the victims' credit and recover as much stolen money as possible. Several of the victims wanted to meet me, and Detective Nolan asked if I'd be willing. I felt responsible even though I hadn't known about my husband's crimes. These women had been hurt because of him, and I'd been married to him, living in the same house where he'd planned and executed his fraudulent schemes. I agreed to meet them, needing to apologize even if the crimes weren't technically my fault. The meeting happened at the FBI field office downtown. Detective Nolan escorted me to a conference room where 5 women waited, ranging in age from late 20s to early 60s. They all looked at me when I entered and I braced myself for their anger. Instead, the oldest woman stood and walked over to me. She introduced herself and thanked me for coming. She said they'd all wanted to meet me because they knew I was a victim too, that my husband had manipulated and hurt me just like he'd hurt them. The other women nodded in agreement. We sat around the conference table and they told me their stories. My husband had targeted professional women with good credit, stealing their information through various means and using it to open credit cards and take out loans in their names. He'd been careful and methodical, spreading the fraud across multiple states to avoid detection. Some of the women had discovered the theft quickly and managed to minimize damage. Others had found out months later when collection agencies started calling about debts they'd never incurred. One woman had nearly lost her house because of a fraudulent second mortgage my husband had taken out using her information. They were all angry, but their anger was directed at him, not me. They asked about my situation, and I gave them a brief overview of the abuse and my escape. Several women cried as I described the 20 years of control and violence. One woman said she'd wondered how a man capable of such calculated financial crimes treated his own family, and now she knew. Another said she was glad I'd gotten out and hoped I was healing. We talked for over an hour, sharing our experiences with my husband's manipulation and the aftermath of his crimes. When the meeting ended, the oldest woman hugged me and told me to take care of myself. She said recovery from this kind of trauma took time, but I was clearly strong enough to survive it. Walking out of that FBI office, I felt lighter. The guilt I'd been carrying about my husband's crimes had eased because these women had shown me grace instead of blame. They understood that I'd been victimized too, that I couldn't have stopped crimes I didn't know were happening. My daughter came home from work 3 weeks later with huge news. She'd been promoted to senior analyst, a position that came with a significant raise and more responsibility. Her boss had called her into his office that morning and told her she'd earned the promotion through her exceptional work over the past 2 years. He knew what she'd been dealing with personally, having watched her maintain perfect performance while planning my rescue and supporting me through the aftermath. He said her dedication and reliability under pressure demonstrated exactly the qualities they valued in leadership. My daughter was glowing as she told me about the promotion. She'd worked so hard for so many years, balancing her career with the enormous burden of documenting abuse and preparing for my escape. She'd spent her 20s sacrificing her own freedom and peace of mind to save me, and I'd worried that the trauma had stunted her professional growth. But she'd thrived despite everything, building a successful career through sheer determination and competence. We celebrated with dinner at her favorite restaurant, and I told her how proud I was of the woman she'd become. She'd survived growing up in an abusive household, witnessed terrible things, carried the weight of my rescue for years, and still managed to build a good life for herself. Her father had tried to break all of us, but she'd refused to let his poison destroy her future. She was strong and capable and successful, everything I'd hoped she'd become despite the circumstances of her childhood. Watching her talk about her new responsibilities and career goals, I felt overwhelming gratitude for this brave girl who'd saved my life. She deserved every good thing coming her way. I had my first good day exactly 3 months after leaving. I woke up that morning and realized I hadn't dreamed about my husband. I got dressed without my hands shaking. I ate breakfast without checking over my shoulder. I went to my volunteer shift at the shelter and helped 3 women with their paperwork without once thinking about my own situation. I met my study group at the library and laughed at someone's joke about accounting humor. I came home to my apartment and cooked dinner while listening to music I'd chosen. At bedtime, I realized I'd gone the entire day without thinking about my husband constantly or startling at sudden noises. It was just a normal day, the kind of day regular people had all the time. But for me, it felt revolutionary. I told Ingrid about it at our next therapy session. She smiled and said this was real progress, that these good days would become more frequent as I continued healing. She warned me that healing wasn't linear, that I'd still have bad days and setbacks and triggers. But the good days mattered because they showed my brain was slowly learning to feel safe again. We talked about what I wanted for my future beyond just surviving. I admitted I'd started thinking about things I might want to do, places I might want to visit, experiences I might want to have. For 20 years, my only goal had been getting through each day without getting hurt. Now I was starting to imagine a future where I wasn't just surviving, but actually living. I wanted to finish my accounting course and find a job. I wanted to rebuild relationships with my sister and brother. I wanted to travel somewhere I'd never been. I wanted to try new foods and read books, and maybe even date someone eventually. These desires felt fragile and scary to voice out loud, but Ingrid encouraged me to keep thinking about them. She said reclaiming my ability to want things and plan for the future was a crucial part of recovery. My husband had trained me to have no preferences, no goals, no dreams beyond serving him. Learning to want things again meant reclaiming the parts of myself he'd tried to destroy. I wanted things again. I wanted to rebuild my accounting career and reconnect with my sister and travel somewhere new and maybe even date someone eventually. These desires felt strange after 20 years of having no preferences, no goals, no dreams beyond getting through each day without getting hurt. Ingrid said reclaiming my ability to want things was crucial for recovery because my husband had trained me to have no opinions about anything. Learning to want things again meant reclaiming parts of myself he'd tried to destroy. The prosecutor called me 3 weeks after my good day to discuss the upcoming federal trial. She explained the trial was scheduled for 7 months from my husband's arrest, with state charges following immediately after. Her voice was confident as she walked me through the evidence, telling me conviction on multiple counts looked certain given the documentation and physical proof. Sentencing would likely result in 15 to 20 years in federal prison before the state charges even started. I did the math silently while she talked. I'd be 72 years old when he got out, finally old enough that maybe he'd leave me alone. The thought should have brought relief, but mostly I felt tired. 25 more years of looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day he'd be free again. My son called that same week with news that made me cry happy tears. He was graduating from his master's program in 2 months, an achievement he'd worked toward while dealing with our family chaos. He'd kept going to classes and writing papers and taking exams, even while helping coordinate my rescue and dealing with his father's arrest. His voice was proud when he told me the graduation date, asking if my daughter and I would come to the ceremony. I said yes immediately, already planning what I'd wear to celebrate this brave boy who'd survived growing up in an abusive household and still managed to build a good life. The graduation ceremony was held at a big university auditorium filled with families cheering for their kids. My daughter and I sat together in the audience, scanning the rows of graduates in caps and gowns until we spotted my son. When they called his name, we both stood up and cheered so loudly that people around us smiled. He walked across that stage with his head high, shaking hands with the dean and accepting his diploma like he'd earned every bit of it. Afterward, in the parking lot, he introduced us to his girlfriend, a kind woman with a warm smile, who he'd been hiding for months because he feared his father's reaction. She hugged me and said she'd heard so much about me, and I realized my son had been building a life separate from his father's control, just like my daughter had. Luca called me into her office 6 weeks after the graduation with papers spread across her desk. She explained the divorce was finalized, a remarkably fast process given the circumstances. The judge had granted everything we requested because my husband's criminal charges and documented abuse made the case straightforward. I was legally free from my husband after 20 years of marriage, no longer tied to the man who'd systematically destroyed my independence. Luca handed me a pen and showed me where to sign, and my hand was steady as I wrote my name on the final documents. My daughter picked me up from the lawyer's office and took me to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown, raising her glass in a toast to my freedom. We ate good food and talked about the future, and I felt lighter than I had in decades. I started applying for jobs the next week, using the skills I'd updated in my accounting course. My resume looked strange with a 20-year gap in employment, but I wrote a brief explanation about my circumstances and sent applications to 15 different companies. 3 of them requested interviews within 10 days, which shocked me because I'd expected rejection. The first interview was at a mid-sized firm downtown, and I was so nervous walking into their office that my hand shook. The interviewer was a woman about my age who reviewed my resume carefully, asking questions about my Princeton degree and my work experience from before my marriage. When she got to the employment gap, I explained briefly that I'd been in an abusive marriage and was rebuilding my life. She nodded with understanding in her eyes and said she admired my courage to start over. She asked detailed questions about my accounting knowledge, and I was surprised to find I could answer everything correctly. My husband had tried to convince me I was stupid, but my brain still worked just fine. A small accounting firm called me 2 weeks after that first interview with a job offer. The position was part-time bookkeeping for local businesses, with modest pay but flexible hours. My boss would be a woman named Zara, who'd built her company from nothing after leaving her own bad marriage 15 years ago. She understood what I'd been through without needing long explanations, and she promised the work environment was supportive and safe. I accepted the job over the phone and then sat on my apartment floor crying happy tears because I was employed again, earning my own money for the first time in 20 years. My daughter came over that evening with a bottle of sparkling cider to celebrate, and we toasted to new beginnings and financial independence. The prosecutor called me 6 months after my husband's arrest to say the federal trial was starting in 2 weeks. She asked if I was prepared to testify about the financial control and abuse, warning me it would be difficult to face him in court. I told her I was ready, even though walking into that courtroom would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. Luca and Detective Nolan both promised to sit right behind me during my testimony, providing support without speaking. The day of my testimony arrived cold and gray, and I dressed carefully in professional clothes that made me feel strong. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with rows of wooden benches and a judge's bench at the front. My husband sat at the defense table in a suit, looking thinner than I remembered but still carrying that same cold anger in his eyes. When the prosecutor called my name, I walked to the witness stand with my head up, refusing to let him see me shake. I told the truth calmly, describing 20 years of financial control, isolation, and systematic abuse. I explained how he'd forbidden me to work, controlled every penny, and used money as a weapon to keep me trapped. When I described the boiling water incident, my husband exploded in anger, shouting that I was lying and that I'd always been dramatic. The judge ordered him removed from the courtroom, and I watched guards drag him out, still yelling. The jury's faces showed shock and disgust, and I knew they'd seen his true nature. The jury came back 4 hours later with guilty verdicts on all federal charges. The identity theft victims sitting in the gallery started crying with relief, hugging each other and thanking the prosecutor. She came over to me afterward and shook my hand, saying my testimony had been crucial to showing the jury who my husband really was. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and the judge reminded my husband he'd face state charges immediately after federal sentencing. My husband stared at me from across the courtroom with pure hatred, but I stared back without flinching because he couldn't hurt me anymore. I met someone at the domestic violence volunteer training 3 weeks after the trial ended. His name was James, and he was another survivor who understood the journey without needing long explanations. We started talking during a break between sessions, sharing bits of our stories carefully like people testing whether it was safe to be honest. He'd left his abusive wife 2 years ago and was rebuilding his life slowly, the same way I was rebuilding mine. We exchanged phone numbers and started meeting for coffee once a week, just conversation and company with no pressure. It felt healthy and safe in a way I'd never experienced, like we were both learning what normal relationships looked like. My daughter met him after a month and approved immediately, noting that he respected my boundaries naturally without me having to explain or defend them. The sentencing hearing happened on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the verdict. The judge sentenced my husband to 18 years in federal prison for identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The state prosecutor stood up immediately after and announced additional charges that would add another 7 years to his sentence. My husband would be 77 years old when he was released, and the judge issued a permanent restraining order extending beyond his sentence. I sat in the gallery feeling overwhelming relief wash over me because he couldn't hurt me or anyone else for decades. He'd be an old man by the time he got out, hopefully too tired and broken to come after me again. My son called me 2 months after the sentencing with news that made me cry happy tears for the second time that year. He was engaged to his girlfriend, and they wanted my help planning the wedding. They asked me to be involved in every decision, giving opinions about venues and flowers and food and music. I got to experience the family connection my husband had stolen from me, choosing things and making plans and being included in something joyful. My daughter would be maid of honor, and we joked about finally having the family celebration we deserved after years of my husband's control and isolation. I worked at the accounting firm for 6 months, handling books for 3 different small businesses and catching errors the previous bookkeeper had missed for years. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning, and I braced myself for criticism out of habit. She smiled and offered me full-time employment with benefits and profit sharing. She said I was the most detail-oriented bookkeeper she'd ever hired, someone who understood numbers naturally and caught problems before they became disasters. I accepted immediately, my hands shaking as I signed the paperwork that made me a real employee again at 53. Walking out of her office, I realized my husband had been completely wrong about my competence, that his constant criticism was designed to break me down rather than reflect any truth about my abilities. I called my daughter during my lunch break to share the news, and she screamed with joy so loud her coworkers probably heard. My daughter mentioned during our weekly dinner that she'd started seeing someone from her office, a person who treated her with patience and respect. She seemed nervous, telling me, watching my face carefully for any reaction that might mirror the control her father exercised. I asked her to tell me more, and she relaxed as she described how they'd been friends for months before anything romantic developed, how this person listened to her and respected her boundaries without making her explain or defend them. She'd been talking to Ingrid about her fears around relationships, worried that watching my marriage had damaged her ability to trust anyone. Ingrid helped her understand that recognizing healthy behavior was actually a strength she'd developed from witnessing abuse, that she could choose differently than I had. I told her I was grateful she wasn't letting her father's poison ruin her chance at love, that she deserved someone kind who saw her value. She cried a little and hugged me tight, admitting she'd been afraid to tell me because she didn't want to hurt me by finding happiness I'd never had. I assured her that her joy was my joy, that watching her build a healthy life was one of the best parts of my freedom. The identity theft victims started reaching out to each other after the trial ended, comparing experiences and realizing we shared similar trauma. One woman suggested we meet monthly for support, and 8 of us showed up to the first gathering at a community center. We shared our stories of discovering the fraud, dealing with credit destruction, fighting to prove we were victims rather than criminals. The validation of being understood without explanation helped all of us process what my husband had done, turning our individual pain into collective healing. Someone mentioned that identity theft laws were weak and victim resources were limited, that we'd all struggled to find help during our recovery. We decided to start advocacy work, contacting legislators and sharing our experiences publicly to push for stronger protections. Turning our pain into purpose gave us all a sense of control we'd lost when my husband stole our identities and finances. We called ourselves the Reclaim Coalition, meeting the third Saturday of every month to support each other and plan our advocacy campaigns. I sat in my apartment one evening staring at my phone, my sister's number pulled up but my finger hovering over the call button. 20 years of forced separation made me terrified she'd reject me, that she'd be too angry about the lost decades to forgive me. I pressed call before I could talk myself out of it, and she answered on the second ring. Her voice saying my name made me start crying immediately, and then she was crying too, saying she'd never stopped looking for me, and never believed my husband's claims that I wanted no contact. We talked for 3 hours that first call, her telling me about her life and me filling in the gaps of mine. She'd hired private investigators twice trying to find me, but my husband had been careful about leaving no trail. We made plans to meet for lunch the following weekend, both of us nervous and excited to see each other again after 2 decades. When we met at the restaurant, she hugged me so hard I could barely breathe, and we sat down and talked for 5 hours straight. She showed me photos of her kids, my nieces and nephews I'd never met, and I showed her pictures of my children as adults. We were rebuilding our relationship from scratch, but the foundation of sisterhood remained underneath all the years of separation. My brother called me 2 weeks after I reconnected with my sister, his voice shaking as he apologized for not fighting harder to stay in my life. I explained that my husband's control had been absolute, that none of my family could have saved me until I was ready to be saved. He told me about the times he'd driven past my house hoping to catch a glimpse of me, the birthday cards he'd sent that were returned unopened, the holidays that felt incomplete without me. We talked about our mother's death and how he'd tried to contact me when she was dying, but my husband had intercepted everything. He blamed himself for not doing more, for eventually accepting my husband's story that I wanted no contact with my birth family. I told him the isolation was calculated and systematic, that my husband had spent years cutting every connection I had to the outside world. We were all healing from the forced disconnection, learning to forgive ourselves for not being able to overcome my husband's manipulation. He visited me the next month, and we spent the day catching up on 20 years of missed memories and inside jokes we thought we'd forgotten. My son called 6 months after his engagement to tell me they'd set a wedding date and he wanted me involved in every decision. I helped choose the venue, a garden space with string lights and room for dancing. I gave opinions about flowers and food and music, experiencing the family connection my husband had stolen from me for so long. My daughter would be maid of honor, and she joked about us finally having the family celebration we deserved after years of isolation and control. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late spring, warm but not too hot, with clear skies and a light breeze. I wore a dress I'd chosen myself in deep purple, a color I loved but had never been allowed to wear. My daughter and I danced together during the reception, laughing and spinning and celebrating our family's new beginning. My son gave a speech thanking everyone for coming, then turned to me and said I was the strongest person he knew, that watching me survive and rebuild inspired him every day. I realized sitting there, surrounded by people who loved me, that I was finally becoming someone I could be proud of, someone who'd overcome impossible odds and come out whole on the other side. My best friend from college found me through social media after reading news coverage of my husband's trial and conviction. She sent a message saying she'd never stopped wondering what happened to me, that she'd tried to find me for years after I disappeared. We met for coffee at a place near my apartment, and seeing her face after 20 years made me cry before we even hugged. She told me about her life, her career as a teacher, her husband and 3 kids, and I told her the abbreviated version of my last 2 decades. She said she'd known something was wrong at my wedding when I looked terrified rather than happy, that she'd tried to talk to me but my husband had intercepted every attempt. We talked for hours, our friendship picking up like no time had passed, the connection my husband couldn't permanently destroy. She invited me to her house for dinner with her family, and I met her husband and kids who'd heard stories about me for years. Having her back in my life felt like recovering a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever, proof that some bonds survive even decades of forced separation. I started looking at apartments in better neighborhoods once my full-time salary made it possible to afford more space. The place I found was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor, with big windows and a small balcony. Nothing fancy, but entirely mine. I signed the lease and moved in with help from my daughter and son, bringing furniture I'd chosen myself and decorations I loved. My daughter helped me paint the bedroom a soft blue that reminded me of the ocean, and we hung photos of our family's new beginning on the walls. The living room had a couch I'd picked because it was comfortable rather than because someone else approved, and the kitchen had dishes in colors I liked. This was the first home I'd had in 20 years that felt safe, where no one monitored my movements or criticized my choices. I stood in my bedroom that first night after everyone left, looking around at the space that belonged only to me, and felt something close to peace settle in my chest. My daughter had left flowers on the kitchen counter with a note saying she was proud of me, and I put them in the window where morning light would hit them. Ingrid told me during our session that I'd made remarkable progress over the past year, and we could reduce our meetings to monthly check-ins. I still had hard days when the panic attacks hit or the nightmares woke me up at 3 a.m, but I'd developed healthy ways to cope that didn't involve shutting down or dissociating. My support network was strong with my children, my sister, my brother, the Reclaim Coalition, and new friends I'd made through the shelter volunteer work. The nightmares were less frequent now, maybe twice a week instead of every night, and I was sleeping through most nights without waking up terrified. Ingrid reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't erase progress, and that I'd done the hardest work already by choosing to leave and rebuild. She said I'd developed resilience and self-awareness that would serve me for the rest of my life, that I'd transformed trauma into growth in ways that inspired her as a therapist. I left her office that day feeling proud of how far I'd come, grateful for her guidance, but also recognizing my own strength in the healing process. I enrolled in a graduate program at the State University to update my master's degree, taking evening classes while working full-time. The program focused on modern accounting practices and technology I'd missed during my 20 years away from the field. My professors were impressed by my experience and perspective, often asking me to share insights about financial systems and business practices. Younger students approached me after class for advice about career paths and work-life balance, seeing me as someone who'd navigated real-world challenges they were just beginning to face. I was reclaiming my identity as an educated, capable professional who had value beyond what my husband had allowed me to believe. Sitting in class, taking notes, and participating in discussions felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd buried for too long. The coursework was challenging but manageable, my brain still sharp despite decades of being told I was stupid and incompetent. I studied at my kitchen table in my own apartment, drinking tea I'd chosen and working at my own pace without anyone criticizing or controlling how I spent my time. My daughter closed on a small house 6 months after I moved into my apartment, a 3-bedroom place with a backyard that needed work, but had good bones. She asked me to help her pick out paint colors for the kitchen, and we spent a Saturday afternoon at the hardware store comparing samples and debating between cream and pale yellow. We settled on a soft butter color that made the room feel warm and welcoming, and I helped her paint it the following weekend, while we listened to music and talked about her promotion at work. The backyard became our project together, clearing out overgrown weeds and planning a garden layout that would give us vegetables in the summer and flowers in the spring. We planted tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and zucchini in neat rows, marking each section with little wooden stakes she'd painted with the plant names. Every Sunday evening became our standing dinner date, alternating between her house and my apartment, a tradition we created deliberately to stay connected without the desperate clinging that marked those first months after my escape. She was thriving in ways that made my chest ache with pride, her career advancing steadily and her personal life blooming with friends and activities she chose freely. The weight of my rescue no longer pressed down on her shoulders, and she moved through the world with confidence that came from knowing she'd saved someone she loved and could now focus on building her own future. The man I'd been seeing for 2 years proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening at my apartment. No fancy restaurant or public spectacle, just the two of us having dinner at my kitchen table. He'd made pasta from scratch, something he knew I loved, and after we finished eating, he reached across the table and took my hand. His proposal was simple and honest, telling me he wanted to spend his life with me if I'd have him, that he loved me and respected me and wanted to build a future together. I said yes without hesitation, feeling certain in a way I'd never experienced before, knowing this relationship had all the healthy markers Ingrid had taught me to recognize. He was patient when I had bad days, kind without expecting anything in return, and secure enough in himself that he never needed to control or diminish me to feel important. My children met him for dinner the following weekend, and I watched nervously as they evaluated this man who wanted to join our family. My daughter hugged him at the end of the night and told me later she approved because he looked at me the way someone should, with genuine affection and respect. My son shook his hand firmly and said anyone who made his mother this happy was welcome in their lives. Ingrid smiled when I told her about the engagement during our monthly session, confirming that this relationship showed all the signs of mutual respect, healthy boundaries, and genuine partnership that I deserved after 20 years of abuse. I completed my graduate program 18 months after starting, walking across the stage at 55 years old to receive my diploma while my entire family cheered from the audience. The ceremony felt surreal, sitting among students half my age in a cap and gown, waiting for my name to be called as proof that my husband hadn't broken me permanently. My sister cried happy tears in the front row, sitting next to my brother, who'd flown in from across the country to attend. My children sat with my fiancé, all of them standing and clapping loudly. When I crossed that stage, celebrating not just the degree, but how far I'd come from the terrified woman who ran from her daughter's apartment with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes. My professors had written me recommendation letters praising my work ethic and insight, noting that my real-world experience combined with academic knowledge made me exceptionally qualified in my field. The diploma in my hands represented more than updated credentials. It was tangible evidence that I'd reclaimed my identity as an educated, capable professional, despite decades of being told I was stupid and worthless. We went out for dinner afterward at a restaurant I chose, ordering food I wanted, celebrating this achievement that belonged entirely to me. My fiancé gave a toast about my strength and determination, and my daughter added that watching me go back to the school had inspired her own career ambitions, showing her that it's never too late to pursue what you want. My accounting firm promoted me to senior bookkeeper 4 months after I graduated, recognizing the skills and dedication I'd demonstrated over the past year. The promotion came with a significant raise that made me financially stable for the first time since leaving my husband, plus benefits including health insurance and retirement contributions. I was managing major client accounts now, handling complex financial records and tax preparation for small businesses throughout the area. My boss asked me to train new employees, teaching them the systems and best practices I'd developed, trusting my judgment and expertise in ways that felt validating after years of having my intelligence questioned. The work challenged me intellectually and gave me purpose beyond just surviving, using my Princeton education and decades of life experience to build something meaningful. I had business cards with my name and title printed on them, a small thing that made me tear up the first time I held them, because they represented my professional identity separate from anyone else. The financial independence this career provided meant I'd never be trapped again, never have to stay somewhere because I couldn't support myself. I opened my own bank account that no one else could access, built credit in my name, and started saving money for the future I was creating. My coworkers respected my opinions in meetings, and clients specifically requested to work with me because they trusted my accuracy and attention to detail. I married my partner 8 months after his proposal in a small ceremony at a local garden, surrounded by 40 people who genuinely loved and supported both of us. My daughter served as my maid of honor, standing beside me in a blue dress we'd picked out together, while my son walked me down the short aisle because I wanted him there representing the family I'd built. The ceremony was simple and personal, with vows we'd written ourselves that focused on partnership, respect, and building a life together based on mutual support. My sister cried throughout the entire event, dabbing at her eyes with tissues and telling me afterward how grateful she was to have me back in her life after 20 years of forced absence. My brother gave a speech at the reception about watching me transform from victim to survivor to someone truly thriving, noting that my strength had inspired everyone who knew my story. My daughter spoke about the journey we'd taken together, from that first night in her apartment when she showed me the truth to this moment, where I was choosing love freely and fully. My son's speech made everyone laugh and cry, talking about how proud he was to see his mother happy and how much he liked his new stepfather. The celebration lasted into the evening with dancing and conversation, people sharing stories and toasting our future, and I felt completely present and joyful in a way I'd never experienced before. My new husband held me close during our first dance, and I wasn't afraid or tense, just grateful to have found someone who saw me as an equal partner worth cherishing. My son and his wife announced their pregnancy 3 months after my wedding, calling to share the news that I was going to be a grandmother. I cried on the phone with joy and excitement, overwhelmed by the chance to be present for this grandchild's life in ways I couldn't be for my own children during their early years. My husband had controlled every aspect of parenting, dictating rules and punishments, using the children as tools to maintain his control over me. This grandchild would know me as I truly was, someone who offered unconditional love without fear or manipulation, who showed up for family events and celebrated milestones freely. My daughter joked during our Sunday dinner that she was next, laughing about how our family was expanding and how much fun it would be to have cousins close in age. We started planning a baby shower together, my daughter and I shopping for decorations and gifts, experiencing the normal family joy that had been stolen from us for so long. My son's wife sent me ultrasound photos that I hung on my refrigerator, tangible proof of the future we were all building together. I bought baby clothes in soft colors, unable to resist the tiny outfits that represented new life and new possibilities. My husband attended doctor's appointments with me to support our son and his wife, integrated into our family in healthy ways that felt natural and right. The letter from the parole board arrived on a regular Tuesday afternoon, official government correspondence informing me that my ex-husband's first parole hearing wouldn't occur for at least 15 more years. The restraining order remained in full effect, and they assured me I'd be notified of any status changes well in advance. I read the letter once, filed it away in a folder I kept for legal documents, and realized I barely thought about him anymore. He occupied so little space in my mind now, just an unpleasant chapter in my past, rather than the defining feature of my present. My therapist had warned me that triggers might always exist, that certain sounds or situations might bring back memories, but the fear and shame had faded significantly. I didn't jump at unexpected noises or panic when someone knocked on my door. I didn't check over my shoulder constantly, or worry that he'd somehow find me despite being locked in federal prison. The nightmares still happened occasionally, maybe once a month now instead of every night, but I had tools to manage them and people to call if I needed support. My life had become full of positive experiences and healthy relationships that pushed those dark years further into the background. I was building a future that had nothing to do with him, creating memories and achievements that belonged entirely to me and the people I chose to share them with. 5 years after my escape, I stood in my kitchen making breakfast for my husband and looking around at the life I'd built. I had a career I loved, a healthy marriage based on mutual respect, strong relationships with both my children, and a growing circle of friends and family who knew my story and supported my continued healing. The woman who ran from that apartment with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes had created an entirely new existence from scratch, rebuilding her identity and independence piece by piece. I was thriving in ways I never imagined possible during those 20 years of captivity, living proof that it's never too late to escape and start over. My job challenged and fulfilled me, using skills I'd thought were lost forever. My marriage provided partnership and companionship without control or fear. My children had healed alongside me, processing their own trauma and building their own successful lives. I had a grandchild on the way who would know me as someone strong and capable, not the broken shell I'd been. I volunteered at the domestic violence shelter regularly, helping other women navigate the same resources that saved my life, sharing my story to give them hope that rebuilding was possible. I'd reconnected with old friends who welcomed me back without judgment and made new friends through work and community activities. I owned my own car now, drove wherever I wanted, made my own choices about everything from what to eat to how to spend my time. The freedom felt both ordinary and extraordinary, appreciating simple autonomy that most people took for granted. My daughter and I spent 6 months writing an article about domestic violence and long-term abuse for a national magazine, hoping our story would help other victims recognize their situations and find courage to leave. We worked together at her kitchen table, comparing notes and memories, crafting a narrative that was honest about the horror, while also emphasizing the possibility of escape and recovery. The magazine published our piece with photos we'd carefully selected. Images of us together now contrasted with the documentation she'd gathered during my marriage. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of women reaching out through the magazine and social media to thank us and share their own experiences. Some were still trapped and asking for advice on how to plan their escape. Others had recently left and needed encouragement that the hard work of rebuilding was worth it. Many were years into their recovery and wanted to share their own success stories, creating a community of survivors supporting each other. My daughter and I answered as many messages as we could, connecting women with resources and offering hope based on our own journey. Several domestic violence organizations invited us to speak at their events, and we accepted some of those invitations, standing together in front of audiences and telling our story with the goal of preventing others from suffering the same fate. The article won an award for public service journalism, but more importantly, it reached women who needed to hear that they weren't alone and that escape was possible. I celebrated my 57th birthday surrounded by my entire family in my daughter's backyard, holding my newborn grandchild with wonder and gratitude while everyone sang and ate cake. My husband had organized the party as a surprise, coordinating with my children to gather everyone I loved in one place. My sister and brother were there with their families, relatives I'd been separated from for 20 years who'd welcomed me back without hesitation. My son and his wife looked tired but happy as new parents, watching me cuddle their baby with obvious joy. My daughter snapped photos constantly, documenting this moment of celebration and connection that felt precious after everything we'd survived. The baby was tiny and perfect in my arms, this new life representing hope and future, and the family we were continuing to build together. My ex-husband had stolen 20 years of my life, but I had decades ahead to be the person I was always meant to be, and I wasn't wasting a single moment. I looked around at the faces of people who loved me genuinely, who supported my healing and celebrated my victories, who wanted me to thrive rather than controlling me into submission. This was what real love looked like, what healthy family felt like, what freedom meant after so long in captivity. The cake was delicious, the conversation was warm and genuine, and I felt completely present and grateful for this second chance at life that I'd fought so hard to claim. My brother pulled me aside later that evening, away from the laughter and noise of the celebration. His eyes wet with tears, he didn't try to hide. He told me our mother would be so proud of how I survived and rebuilt my life, that she'd known I was strong even when I couldn't see it myself. His words broke something loose inside me, some final piece of shame I'd been carrying around like a stone in my chest. I finally forgave myself for the years I lost, understanding that I did the best I could with the resources and awareness I had at the time. The shame I carried for so long transformed into something different, something that felt like pride for my strength and resilience, for the fact that I made it out alive and built something real from the wreckage. I looked around at my life now and barely recognized it from 5 years ago, when I ran from that apartment with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes and terror in my throat. I'm successful now, with a career I love and financial independence I never thought I'd have again. I'm loved by people who actually know me, who see my flaws and complexities and choose me anyway. I'm genuinely happy in ways I didn't know existed during those 20 years of captivity. My ex-husband tried to destroy me, tried to break me down into nothing so he could rebuild me as his perfect victim, but instead, he showed me exactly how strong I could become when I finally had the chance. I'm not just surviving anymore, white-knuckling my way through each day and hoping to make it to the next one. I'm truly living now, making choices and taking risks and building relationships and pursuing dreams, and it's better than I ever imagined possible back when I thought love meant control and pain meant protection.